Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, the sanctimoniously notorious RMB, bringing you Robservations, the show about something. This is, of course, Robservations episode number 149 for all of the imagination connoisseurs here that are part of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. I cannot believe I'm one episode away from 150 episodes. You guys have kept me going this long. I want to thank you for that. And as always, you should know that these chats are brought to you by Lucky Tiger men's grooming products for those men who want to look good and feel great. You can go to luckytiger.com, or actually, pardon me, you can go to getluckytiger.com if you're interested in their products. I literally just use their facial scrub, as I always do before I go on, and I feel brisk and I feel good about it. But if you go to getluckytiger.com, which is their website, you can use PGS for Post-Geek Singularity Community when you check out, and you get 20% off their order. How cool is that? Well, welcome to this, the Tuesday edition of Robservations, the show about something. And when I'm looking for something to talk about, like, I try and keep it evergreen. I don't want to review movies unless I can do it in such a way, like when I did my Godzilla King of the Monsters review, not review, but overview of it, which, by the way, I stand by, just so you know. I want it to be evergreen, so people who might discover this channel today can always go back and find something of value that isn't sort of played out. Look, I understand with Godzilla or maybe Avengers Endgame, it might get played out. That could be. I understand. But for the most part, I want to keep the topics evergreen. However, sometimes a topic comes along that can be both evergreen and it can also be topical. And I didn't have a topic for today's conversation. I didn't know what it was going to be about until I was on the JOHN CAMPEA show today. And he brought something up, and we kind of got into it. We had a little bit of a mano-y-mano, back and forth. And it was about Michelle Rejwan. I think it's Rejwan. I think that's how you pronounce her name, Michelle Rejwan. Maybe it's Rejwan. I'm not sure. Who is Michelle Rejwan, you may ask? Well, yesterday it was reported on June 17th by Deadline, the industry paper of note, actually the industry website of note, that Michelle Rejwan has been named the Senior Vice President of Live Action Development and Production for LucasFilm. So John and I were talking about this, and we were basically on opposite sides of the issue. And John was saying that he didn't necessarily think that this was a good choice for this position because of her lack of experience. And I pointed out that I thought it was. And it got me thinking about Hollywood's perception amongst people outside of the Hollywood system and the reality of what it's like to work in the Hollywood system. And, what that all means. So I wanted to bring this up as a topic, because if there's one thing I can tell you, sure, have I become Francis Ford Coppola or Steven Spielberg in my Hollywood career? Absolutely not. However, I do have 30 years of professional experience working all throughout Hollywood. And one of the first jobs I ever had was working in feature production at Warner Brothers. I was what was called a management trainee. And I worked for the senior vice president of production at Warner Brothers, Bill Young. Bill Young in our department was in charge of oversight of every single movie that Warner Brothers had in production. And the way that our department worked was Bill Young was the senior vice president of production, and then underneath him were three what were known as executive production managers. And each one of those three people was usually assigned about 5 movies at a time. And basically, they would oversee the production of each one of these movies from the studio's perspective. So they were the point people for each one of the 5 productions that they covered. And then they would report to Bill. So if there's any problems or things were going awry, they were in charge of that from the studio perspective. Now, one of the movies that they made at Warner Brothers when I was there was Bonfire of the Vanities. And let me just say, I learned an incredible amount about how Hollywood works watching that movie get made from the studio perspective. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. That's what I'm really going to delve into. But of course, before we get there, I'm going to, of course, start with some viewer mail, as I always do. We've got some great viewer mail today. And if you want to send me a letter, as always, you can write me at the Burnettwork.net website. Send it to me on the website. And I'm getting deluged with mail. So, and some people send me a lot of topics that are not necessarily for public consumption. They're more personal, and that's fine too. I have no problem with that. But I try, keep in mind, if you want me to read your letter on the air, I'd like it to be more of a general topic that most people would find interesting, which is great. And I want to thank everybody, members of the Post-Geek Singularity community, for doing just that for the most part. I get incredible letters. I think I've got the greatest community on YouTube, my viewers, my listeners, my watchers, and I want to thank you for that. And that is never more so evidenced as it is in the letters people send. So to start out, I have a letter from Mr. David Miller. This one starts out, David Miller says, "Hello, Rob. I wanted to send you a rather involved missive regarding..." Well, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That was Tallulah and Gilbert. For whatever reason, they reacted to something and went outside. So let me start again. "Hello, Rob. I've wanted to send you a rather involved missive regarding what I see as an assault on the arts in this country, and by extension, how it's affected the Star Trek property. But I just don't have the time right now. So I'm going to talk about another topic that's easier to summarize. Yes, it's not as important, and it's definitely self-indulgent, but I just feel like bringing it up. I love the first X-Men movie, but I always thought it was a mistake to have Xavier's school chock full of mutants. I felt that one of the things that lent the group its mystique, no pun intended, was the mutants' rarity. I loved how, in the comics, you had this sprawling facility that only seemed to service 5 to 7 students at a time. Did Xavier use his mental powers to make passersby see an entire student body? Aside from these concerns, having all those extra mutants took screen time away from the lead characters. Storm wasn't handled very well in the movies, but it didn't help. When the audience was looking at her, they were wondering if there was much more interesting mutants just around the corner. Along those lines, I also thought it wasn't wise to have the Enterprise have all of these alien crew members aboard, starting with the Next Generation. Wouldn't Spock's exotic nature be blunted if there were other alien members on the bridge? I think it was Spock's unique role as the other that also made the character so powerful. This was perfectly illustrated in the animated series with the inclusion of Erix and Maress. Not horrible characters, but utterly lacking in anything memorable. Come on, dude. Maress, lacking in anything memorable? Meow. Not horrible characters, but utterly lacking in anything memorable. And their dullness threatened to rub off on Spock, making a trend that all of the alien crew members were ciphers. Again, if multi-species crews were commonplace, how come we only see Klingons on Klingon ships, Romulans on Romulan ships, Andorians on Andorian ships? You get my point. I'm just afraid studios these days are into tonnage. If one resident alien is good, then 20 is 1,000 times better. So whether it's aliens or comic collecting, rarity adds value. Toodles, David Miller, Doc Civil. Well, that's actually an interesting question. And as evidenced by one of my favorite Star Trek episodes, the Immunity Syndrome, the heavy cruiser starship Intrepid was manned by Vulcans. But I think that if you have the United Federation of Planets in terms of Star Trek, I would just assume that there would be many different aliens from many different species and places all over the galaxy that would be manning Starfleet ships. Since Starfleet was basically created by the United Federation of Planets and the founding members of the Federation, I think there's 5 founding members. There's Earth, Alpha Centauri, Teller Prime, Andoria, and Vulcan. Weren't those the 5 founding members of the Federation? You'd probably see more of those people on ships. But even when we were making the Axanar feature film, we talked about the fact that a lot of these races, when the Federation was formed, would tend to keep themselves on ships because it would be easier to function amongst themselves, understanding what the needs were. But as Starfleet expanded and there was more and more aliens that would join, and of course the Federation and Starfleet would want to open up their recruitment to other alien species, which would just make us, I think, stronger. One of my favorite additions was in the Star Trek novels of Diane Duane. She created a character named Ensign Narat, who was a Horta. There was actually a Horta. The Horta from Devil in the Dark became a crew member on the Enterprise, which I thought was great. I love that. But in terms of Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, I think, look, it was a shorthand to show that there was a lot more mutants in the world. I thought it added flavor, especially from a filmmaking perspective, to what was going on. And it was a school, but I think you might be right. I mean, we don't want to necessarily take away the focus, but as far as the animated series was concerned, remember, a lot of this comes down to budget, how much they can show, and I think it's important to be mindful of that. Showing Mares and Erex was a cool way to show us alien creatures that they couldn't have ever shown us on the weekly Star Trek series because of budgetary restrictions. But again, to me, as long as it's done with great verisimilitude, I'm all for it. I like seeing that kind of flavoring. And look, the one thing, just background characters don't necessarily take away from Spock, because what Spock was doing is he metaphorically stands in for all aliens, for any people that are othered and are trying to fit in an environment. And there's one thing that I think one of the reasons that Star Trek hasn't perhaps necessarily translated globally as much as people might have wanted is that, look, rightly or wrongly, when Star Trek came out, it was definitely from an American perspective. It was never considered, or was never conceived of. They wanted it to be to show international, the whole world, that the Federation would represent all of the planet Earth. But because it was made in the United States, and it was made by Gene Roddenberry, it was created by Gene Roddenberry, it has a uniquely American perspective. Star Trek is very much the Camelot Kennedy era, at least the original series, and really represents American values, which is, I think, very apparent to the rest of the world, even on this planet, which is why sometimes it doesn't translate very well foreign. But the idea eventually was that we were going to be, I think, a one world and sort of a one galaxy idea. And to be fair, one of the things I actually do like about Star Trek Discovery, and I did like about JJ Abrams' Star Trek 09, is the representation of other kinds of aliens on the Enterprise. Although it is, depending on how they are portrayed and the way they look, it can get kind of goofy. The design of these aliens is really, really important. I think one of the problems that the Star Wars prequels had, especially in The Phantom Menace, when you meet all the pod racers, they're pretty goofy. And their actual design, because they're basically CG creations, destroyed some of the verisimilitude. When you went into the bar in Mos Eisley in Star Wars, yes, sure, you had the Wolfman and things like that, and the demon with the horns, but because they were prosthetic makeups, they look real. And when you add a lot of CG characters suddenly, and you're intercutting them with human beings, it's really difficult to get the physics correct with CG characters, full CG characters that are interacting with human beings, because that's the telltale. That's when verisimilitude goes by the wayside. It's really hard to recreate the actual physics of a living being and how they interact with the real world if it's CGI, especially next to a computer-generated character. But ultimately, I'm all for that kind of interaction. I like seeing different kinds of mutants. I really do. But your point is well taken. It's a difficult needle to thread, and I don't necessarily think you're wrong. But interesting topic, and appreciate it. Really, really compelling. What do you guys think? This next one comes from Ace, just Ace. And who can think of Ace without thinking of Ace Frehley from Kiss? I don't think Ace Ventura pet detective. I think about Ace. Or maybe it's Ace from Megaforce, depending on how old you are. Anyway, this comes from Ace. Dear Mr. Sanctimonious One, formalities. Been following Campea since the AMC days, then stopped watching YouTube altogether for some time. It's hard to keep all the dates accurate. Drugs, they rock. Anywho, I found him again later when I started watching the YouTubes again, along with you. I found that I outgrew my interest in Campea much the same way I got over Howard Stern in my mid-20s. 40 now. Thank God for Campea, because he led me to you. Albeit Campea is like the best source for info, in my humble opinion. He does try and be the ESPN of geekdom. That he does. Al Grano, or is it Al Grano? To the point. I found your POV on Campea to be, well, not to offend anybody, it was far more mature or sensible. Then as I began to watch your channel, I discovered why you had more worldly views on things. For me, it's hard to express my feelings on the IPs I follow because I know my view is fringe as fuck. This letter comes hot off the heels from Robservations 148. When the final piece of the puzzle that would propel me to write this letter came, as you said clearly, I don't like JJ Abrams. Wait a minute. I've never met JJ Abrams personally. He might be a delightful fellow. I do not like the movies that he's made, for the most part. First, I began to notice that you were slowly expressing how you felt about the state of Star Wars and Trek with the last couple of episodes about Kennedy. What it all came down to, in not so many words, or these words exactly, was, quote, hey, I don't like the current Star Wars trilogy as a whole. I'm no fan of Episode 7, but I think Episode 8 is better than Episode 7. This is a very unpopular view, but that is how I feel too. Episode 7 is just a rehash of Episode 4, but is not Episode 4 just a rehash, albeit in plot only, of the Hidden Fortress? I have felt that Abrams slid with Episode 7 for that very reason. Lucas was paying homage to Kurosawa, and so is the case made that JJ was paying homage to Lucas. I call it playing it safe as F and getting closer to what sparked me to finally write you. Then you said, again, in not so many words, or these words exactly, through episodes of Campea in your own channel, Captain Marvel was better than Shazam, and Shazam was not all that good in reality. Blasphemy. Look at the IMDb scores, they'll say. Look at all the websays that have done about how epic Shazam is, they'll proclaim. Even Campea had a fit on his show when you were trying to your best explain to him that it was not that good. I can make another letter on how amazingly groundbreaking a feature Captain Marvel is, and also objectively slam a horribly bland train wreck action sequence that feels like lazy trash. But Shazam to me was a dated paint by numbers superhero movie of which it felt tragically stuck in its genre, that it was the same thing that made it dated and bland to me. Had Shazam come out before Iron Man, so like in the 90s or early aughts, then it would probably have crushed. I can go on, but in reality, I can't. In this current climate, to disagree is to be a pariah, and then you get labeled racist or a social justice warrior. Oh my God, which one is it then? You see, Marvel has changed the game in the superhero genre. They make movies that happen to have superheroes in them. Absolutely. As stated previously, I can write a whole letter on how I feel about these two films. Those point of view on the mentioned films cannot come from a pale-faced virgin who lives in his mom's basement and fits into the tribalist mentality of fandom. Unfortunately, fandom is largely populated by these geeks because they sure aren't nerds. Nerds are smart, geeks are not. Uh-oh, them's fighting words. They're just into the same nerdy things, yet lack the intelligence or experience to fully understand what they are ingesting or how to even ingest it, for that matter. Then you said it. To not like Abrams in this current pop culture climate is very unpopular, but I can't stand his stuff. To me, the man is nothing more than a glorified 80s Xerox machine. He just copies movie plots and refits them with a new coat and some modern coolness. The man has yet to make one original movie. Cloverfield is Godzilla, Super 8 is E.T., and Episode 7 is Episode 4, damn it. Episode 7 should have been called Forced Awoken. I have very low hopes for Episode 9, or should I call it now and just refer to it as Episode 6.2? So why this letter? Yeah, I went on my rant, and thanks for reading. But the point is that this channel feels like the only place where I can voice such challenging opinions with a healthy retort. To have such opposing points of view is not the problem. It's that we can't engage in discourse without some zealot flipping out over not having someone agree with them. What an entitled group this fandom is. I got into all that encompasses the Post-Geek Singularity because it was a place where ideas were exchanged, and to come up with a community of ideas, not a prison of dogma. Let us return to what companies like Marvel had set up. Let us make this Post-Geek Singularity a house of ideas. Enough said. P.S. I live in Northridge in the San Fernando Valley in Southern California. I hear you're in Pasadena. Hey, man, would love to catch a movie with you and pick that brain. Keep up the good work. Ace. I like this letter. I like this letter because I like the fact that somebody, my whole raison d'etre here has become, it didn't start out this way, by the way. When I started this YouTube channel and started doing Robservations back in December, which was actually at the behest of Elizabeth. You know, she wanted me to do my own, she was always pushing me to do my own channel. John Schnepp first floated the idea to me before he passed away when we first were doing Heroes. But I didn't know, to be honest, how this channel was going to evolve. Like V'ger at the end of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. I had no idea. And all I did was sort of bring my perspective and my point of view to this. And what has happened, delightfully surprising to me, is that we have this community, this Post-Geek Singularity community, all of you imagination connoisseurs, and we have been, at least people started to recognize, I guess, that I have positivity, and they were responding to that. But this was not some affectation. I did not make a decision to be like, I'm going to be a beacon of positivity in the fan community. What I have been is just myself. I think if anybody has known me, they know that what you see is what you get. And my fandom, I genuinely love fandom, and I've been a part of it my whole life. And I guess I grew up in a time where there wasn't a lot of movies and TV and comic books and things. It was very, I felt I was very much a part of the fringe. And even when I would get a movie that I thought was pretty bad, I still took delight in it because it was science fiction, fantasy, and horror, and there just wasn't a lot of it, you know. And to get any of it, I would look at it and go, okay, this is bad, but I like science fiction, fantasy, and horror. So I always looked for something that I really enjoyed about it. And in my lifetime, I watched suddenly I lived through being delivered the classics of the genre. Like when I was a kid, when it came to science fiction films, there was probably 10 canonical science fiction films that people would always cite as being great. And people would say that, yes, they are objectively great. And nobody dismissed that. Nobody would ever dispute it. And just to give you an example of what some of those movies were in the science fiction genre, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, 1927, right? Then we would say Day the Earth Stood Still, directed by Robert Wise. Forbidden Planet was up there. The original Planet of the Apes. 2001, of course, is the granddaddy, probably still is the granddaddy of science fiction films. And then up until Star Wars, which completely changed the world. You could add a bunch of other movies, but I would say the original War of the Worlds was part of that, but there just wasn't a whole lot. And then I had become a fan, but when I was 10 years old, I watched things like, oh my God, we got Star Wars, and then we got Alien and Superman the movie, and it went on from there. And horror films were the same way. I mean, when I was a kid, I hadn't even seen these movies yet, but I think there were a lot more genre classics as far as horror was concerned than science fiction. But I hadn't seen a whole lot of them. I'd seen Universal monster movies, and I hadn't seen Rosemary's Baby, and I hadn't seen The Exorcist because I was too young. I would consider it to be Jaws, even though Jaws is an adventure film, it's still also a great horror movie. And that was really the first time I saw Jaws in a theater, and it was amazing. But whether I was watching bad B science fiction and horror movies from the 50s, I loved it all. So it didn't matter to me whether something was good or bad. I was always looking for some joy that I could extract from things. So it's very baffling to me now to see where we've come from, but not entirely, because even with Star Trek, what's funny is people think, "Oh, you've become a Star Trek hater," and I'm like, "Well, that's not true." I've even had a problem with certain elements of Star Trek, beginning with Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. I know, I know. One of the things when I saw Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan that I didn't get and did not like, and people are going to be like, "What?" I didn't like the uniforms. People would say, "What?" Coming off the heels of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the uniforms in Star Trek: The Motion Picture made sense to me. I didn't understand why in Star Trek II everybody's wearing naval pea coats, basically coats that would be not out of place in the conning tower of a nuclear submarine before it dove in the North Atlantic. I mean, it didn't make sense to me that you'd be wearing these big, thick jackets as part of your uniform on a spaceship. But I mean, I got it. I understand that the nautical feel was something that Nicholas Meyer was going for. But anyway, I'm just what I'm trying to say is that I took joy in all of it. Now, there's this weird thing in fandom where it seems to me that cogent, thoughtful criticism has gone by the wayside. It's you're either for or against something. People suddenly like when I watch The Last Jedi, for instance, I look at things like what do I like about this movie? For instance, at the beginning, people have talked about Rose's um uh her sister, I forget her name, but her sister who's doing the bombing run. People are like, well, I'll give you an example of my thought process. How can you have drop bombs in space in an environment that doesn't have gravity, and how does that work? Well, the first thing that I thought of when I was watching this movie, I'm like, oh, cool. Those bombs clearly have some kind of attractive, they have some kind of mechanism that they can target where they're going and use some kind of, whether it's a gravity beam, there's something in those bombs that allow them to be dropped on something in space, and they're directed. Like, it never occurred to me like, well, there's no gravity in space. I was just like, in my mind, I would fill these things in. So those things don't bother me. But anyway, I just try and find something to like about things first. And then if I can't, and if I can't surmount my own belief system, then I start going back and saying, why am I criticizing this? But first and foremost, now it's all about story, and it's about intent. And I think, unfortunately, now these things have now become so successful that there's a lot of people jockeying for position to get on our favorite genre entertainment. And a lot of the time, once they're there, they're not necessarily qualified to be working or working on they don't necessarily care about the properties the way. And I always go back to this. I keep coming back to Ryan Coogler as a creative force who he himself had an idea to revitalize the Rocky franchise that was based on his love of Rocky. Now, and he was successful at it. And I often think, why is not Hollywood going out and addressing that, like going out through the agencies perhaps and saying, okay, is there any filmmaker that would like to take a stab at revitalizing a moribund franchise and throwing out the net and asking? That's not how Hollywood works, by the way. They don't do that. But I've often wondered, like, why not? A guy like Ryan Coogler parlayed his Fruitville Station success not huge, necessarily huge box office wise, but he received great notices on the film festival circuit. And then he was able to use that to parlay it into getting a movie like Creed. And that's to me the way Hollywood should work. You know, if you're deemed, if your movie, if you get anointed as being cool on the film festival circuit, that's powerful, because then within the Hollywood community, you've got some cachet. You become cool in the zeitgeist, and people are like, ooh, that guy's, I haven't seen Fruitville Station, but I know the director's cool. And of course, Fruitville Station is actually, I think, a great film. And when it works out, it's pretty great when that happens. But to me, that's a perfect example of how I think a movie should work. But then again, Creed wasn't, as expensive as a tentpole property. Anyway, I'm kind of going off. I want to stay a little bit more focused. But thanks for that letter. I really enjoyed that. I'll read another one. This one comes from Aaron Brown. Hello, Rob. Greetings from Camden, southwest of Sydney, Australia. This is my first time writing in after having become a great fan of your show, and indeed the Post-Geek Singularity. I love your YouTube show playing in my ears daily as I work, along with the JOHN CAMPEA Show, which I enjoy best when you are impressing your take on topics to either contrast or round out that of John, who I personally find to be quite pedantic and narrow in his outlook, but I still enjoy taking in his perspective. Your show, however, I find to be intellectually enriching, and I more often than not take something away from each episode, whether it's an insight or information on something in the geek sphere or altogether elsewhere that I didn't previously have, or a new perspective on a topic I hadn't considered. I really appreciate what this platform brings to the worldwide community of us that share these interests in film, fandom, sci-fi, and everything in between, and how we can have intellectual discussion and reasoned debate, something that is extremely rare in an online forum. Like numerous other viewers or fans, I'm primarily writing in with my perspective on the Kathleen Kennedy Disney Star Wars discussion. I think it's important that you highlight not only her stellar achievements in the industry, but indeed the standing that this enviable resume has afforded her. Whilst unlike many, I don't place blame for what I find to be lackluster films at her feet. I can understand the viewpoint that as the public head of the team creating these films, many feel the buck stops with her. My closest friend and I have been Star Wars fans since we were toddlers. Indeed, it's a key element that solidified our bond. And through the years, we have gone on to midnight screening openings of the prequels, and when they were released, attended all manner of conventions and related cosplay, and waited arduously in lines for signings with the original trilogy cast. With the news of Disney taking over Lucasfilm, our outlook on the prospect differed significantly. I was far more optimistic for the new films, whilst he was skeptical, with underlying hope. Following on from seeing The Force Awakens together, our opinions diverged further. Whilst I found the film perfunctory, albeit in an uninspired rehash of many of the elements from the original trilogy, I was willing to give the film a pass, as it was the setup for a trilogy, and overall it had piqued my interest with enough left unanswered for the next installments to explore. Unfortunately for my friend, it was everything he was dreading and gave him the ammunition to write off the Disney Star Wars efforts almost entirely. Whilst I greatly enjoy debating these sorts of things with him and several other of my closest friends, it is indeed a tenet of our friendship I do acknowledge the traits of the often mentioned toxic fandom that exist in all of us. For me, though, as I'm always hungry to stay informed on all things that bear my interest, I do seek out the updates on projects, fan opinions, and theories, so at least I'd like to think I'm well informed on many of these things. With the sequel trilogy, I find that the main issue overall, as has been touched on in your show previously, is the apparent lack of an overall plan to the whole thing. Alarm bells definitely rang for me when they announced each film would have a different director. I know this happens often with television, but it's my understanding that the writing of the series is consistent irrelevant of this, where I think you can agree with the Star Wars films this hasn't seemed to be the case. Having JJ Abrams as the director of The Force Awakens seemed like a decent choice to me. Whilst I didn't feel his Star Wars films did anything, seemed like a decent choice to me. Whilst I didn't feel his Star Trek films did anything to expand the Trek universe as I have known it, and I fully understood the ire they received from many Trek fans, I found them to be enjoyable enough films with good spectacle. As my aforementioned friend astutely brought to my attention, Abrams loves to operate with plot devices he calls the mystery boxes, which are basically unexplained mysteries that the audience is never intended to discover the answer or meaning behind. As a viewer, I find this sort of thing to be incredibly frustrating, and sure enough, he brought it to Star Wars. I'm certain JJ's initial intention was to leave Rey's parentage a mystery, as this was the biggest point of speculation with the audience leaving the film. Also, with Snoke, I believe he had no intention to further explore any backstory for the character beyond he was apparently evil, powerful, and in charge. All concede that these mystery elements can be used to great effect when used right and sparingly, in the case of setting up this sequel trilogy. However, they left so many unexplained questions to the audience that immersing themselves back into that universe became difficult. For starters, the setting of this trilogy is something like 30 years after Return of the Jedi. Apparently, there is a very Empire-like entity in the galaxy now, only they aren't called the Empire. They're the First Order, and they even have their own stormtroopers. But there won't be any explanation as to how they came about or why they are called the First Order, or really anything about them other than they are more space Nazis. The Resistance, too, are given nothing of an explanation. They are the Rebel Alliance. There are even some of the very same people involved in the hierarchy, but again, there is no exposition on why there was a need for the name change or any of that. There was definitely no verisimilitude here, good sir. Couldn't agree with you more. That same annoying lack of insight or development continued to the apparent fact that there was a republic in the universe once more. But hey, we don't need to know anything about that other than that they are largely going to die at the hands of the space Nazis because reasons, I guess. This same lack of development plagues the characters of the sequel trilogy also. As you have pointed out on the show before, Rob, these characters have largely failed to break into the pop culture zeitgeist in the way that previous characters in the franchise have before. I would say this is largely because they are uninspired, underdeveloped, and bland characters that give us little to connect to. For me, the characters of Finn and Poe should have been one character. The cocky, cavalier, hotshot pilot nature of Poe would have made for a far more compelling dynamic had he also been a First Order officer or pilot that was caught or imprisoned or wound up involved with the plot surrounding the map to Skywalker, only to have a moral quandary when crossing paths with Rey, causing him to rethink his motives. This feeds directly to where I feel the creative team at Disney or Lucasfilm have gone astray with the writing. In the original trilogy, much of what makes the films great is the dynamic between the main leads. These are three characters that would not interact with one another naturally outside of being thrown together by circumstances in the original film. It is the friction between them, even once they have established a fondness for one another, that makes for great viewing. Enter the sequel trilogy, and Disney have a golden chance in getting that original cast back for these sequel films. The longtime fans have hoped for this to happen for a long time. Unfortunately, the team at Disney made the absurd choice to have the original cast share no screen time together as a trio. Instead, the audience finds their beloved characters in disparate positions, with little to no explanation as to how they wound up where they are at this point. This again feeds into the Abrams mystery box plot points. Throughout The Force Awakens, we find that Han and Leia have separated. There's no great explanation for this. Was it the result of their son turning to the dark side? That's unclear. Mystery box. We learn that Luke has gone far afield, possibly in search of the first Jedi Temple. Why? Mystery box. It's hinted at that Big Bad Snoke was involved in Ben turning to the dark side and that he appears fearful of having Luke return. There's no exposition on this. Another damn mystery box. Now, I'll admit that having mystery in your plot can be great, especially in the first film of a trilogy. Things like, how did Luke Anakin's lightsaber end up in that chest at Maz Kanata's on Takodana? Great, that's intrigue. As you and the viewers have discussed on the show recently, the original trilogy benefited greatly from these unexplained bits of intrigue, like the idea of the Clone Wars, the Jedi Order, Vader having been a Jedi, unexplained bounty hunters, and disintegrations. These all had us going as fans for years on end. To this end, I can fully understand what Abrams was going for. However, he chose to have next to no setup on the key establishing points of where this universe and its known characters were at this time and why. The original Star Wars film gives us a great setup early on in establishing the hierarchy of the Empire just through a simple board meeting, establishing where they're at. It sets the scene. They have this weapon. They have an emperor. He's dissolved the Senate. These regional governors are in control. Vader is a relic of a bygone time that his peers are suspicious of, but he's a loose cannon and not to be messed with. It does all of this in a few minutes. The Force Awakens does none of this. Tantamount to the issues resulting from a lack of overarching plan or vision with the team at Disney Lucasfilm, The Last Jedi compounds the issues set by the previous film with its outset of let the past die. If this was the film's key objective and focal point of its marketing, Ben and Kylo's line of let the past die, kill it if you have to, spoke greatly of what they were trying to do with the franchise with this film. The objective was clear. This was to be a rebirth, a moving on point. Having that plan is all well and good. A fresh take on the Star Wars universe is something that should be embraced, I feel. But this was at odds with what the original plan appeared to be heading into The Force Awakens by continuing the story of the original trilogy characters. This mixed message is something I feel plagues the entire trilogy, and this film is an exercise in excruciatingly poor handling. From the get-go, The Last Jedi hits us, the audience, in the face with ham-fisted poor humor. It automatically doesn't feel like Star Wars with what essentially is a prank call moment with General Hux. This sets the uncomfortable tone for most of the film. You can't help but get the sense that the film was written to not only undo elements established in the previous film, but also change the established status quo of what had come before. The heavy drama of Luke handing his old lightsaber the heavy drama of Luke being handed his old lightsaber at the end of The Force Awakens is instantly cheapened here to be a psych gotcha gag, and boy, do they keep coming. Audiences can be forgiven for the feeling that Rian Johnson hated what JJ Abrams created with the previous film, with the apparent deliberate retcons of the film in Last Jedi, from moments like the lightsaber throw gag to killing off the apparent big bad in another. Psych gotcha moment, to the unforgettable decision to not even acknowledge the fact that a huge beloved character in Han Solo had died in the previous film. That apparently doesn't matter here. I just lost my point of view. As I find it, I'm lost. You know what? I'm going to stop for a second. Now, I really like these points of view. I like what you're saying. And I think that one of the reasons I didn't like The Force Awakens was because it has no story. It's like they're telling you what was very interesting. Star Wars begins in the midst of a battle, but in that battle, the first characters that we're introduced to are R2 and 3PO. And what was really interesting is very Hidden Fortress like. And then we were introduced to the princess, and this is coming after a crawl. If you watch Star Wars, the whole opening crawl is then laid out for you in the next 5 minutes of the movie. You're never asking yourselves any questions at all because the crawl is then supported by visuals and you everything you need to know. And so we know exactly where we're supposed to be. We meet R2 and 3PO, these functionaries. We meet the princess. They get sent on their mission. And through it's a very direct through line from the opening credits. You know that the plans to the Death Star need to get to the rebellion, so maybe they can blow it up. That's what it's established, and we literally follow those plans through the entire film. You know, and sometimes we cut away onto the Death Star and meet people. We meet them in Vader, so we know where we're at, and that's where Princess Leia is at. And it's very clear from a narrative standpoint. And when we meet Luke, the thing about Luke is Star Wars is about a farm boy, a farmer, and a truck driver. Han Solo's a truck driver. He's the bandit, or he's Jerry Reed, really. And he brings bootleg moonshine to whoever needs it. So Harrison Ford's character, Han Solo's a truck driver and Luke's a farmer. There's no more easily understood characters than those characters. And it's easy to follow. And once Ben Kenobi is the wizened former grizzled army officer. All the other stuff that you learn about the Clone Wars, all of that is just window dressing that piques our interests. But the central narrative thrust of all of that is very straightforward. And that's why Star Wars works as well as it works. It's a stripped down narrative that's completely easy to understand. And you, as an audience member, never ask yourselves any questions about any of this, because the Clone Wars, none of that matters. It's all of this backstory that we're hearing about, because every moment of Star Wars is about returning the Death Star plans to the rebellion. And as we learn, maybe a weakness can be found. That's it. Can they destroy the Death Star, the ultimate weapon that we learn about in the crawl? So the audience in Star Wars is never asking themselves any other question than, will they get the plans? Will they rescue the princess? And will they be able to destroy the Death Star? That's it. The Force Awakens, on the other hand, is one question after another, beginning with, why is there even why are there TIE fighters and stormtroopers? If the Empire was defeated at the end of Return of the Jedi, why do these things still exist? I mean, that is a question that's in your mind. I mean, they try and tell you, but to me, that's the big mistake of the film. I mean, it just doesn't work as a story. I mean, they talk about this, they pay lip service to this thing about the map and finding Luke Skywalker, but even finding Luke Skywalker, so what? I mean, finding Luke there's no resolution to that story. You just go find him. The Force Awakens has no story. There's no story beyond that. It meanders around. So you have no narrative like, okay, Luke Skywalker's gone, but it doesn't matter, because in finding him, there's nothing he necessarily needs to do, such as, oh, I don't know, destroy Starkiller Base. So it doesn't work. So I do appreciate what you're saying in this letter. So let me go. I'm going to continue on. So remember, this letter is coming from Aaron Brown, and I'm going to continue on here with his letters. So where were we? I found it. I lost it. This is a long letter. So, okay. Well, anyway, the original Star Wars film gives us a great setup early on in establishing the hierarchy of the. Oh, I already read that. I didn't realize. Here we go. No, instead, we are given more pointless, underdeveloped characters. Rose Tico, a character clearly inserted just to give the now abundantly useless character of Finn something to do for the duration of the film, that results in one of the most pointless side plots that takes up way too much screen time and ultimately does very little to service the real plot of the film. That is essentially the rebels, the resistance now, are getting away very, very slowly. Honestly, that main plot feels like it is from an Austin Powers movie, as in that it's a parody of itself. In terms of how the characters are treated, I don't hate the idea of having Luke be dejected or conflicted in the wake of tragedy and questioning himself, the Jedi, and the Force. That's got great potential to be excellent character development. However, we find a Luke that has elements of that, only to be very unlike what we know to be Luke, in the nature that he has no desire to help his friends when he is faced with their plight. This had been a defining trait of the character in the original trilogy, so much so that it was brought into question by his mentors and the Emperor, and ultimately was the key to why he was unique compared to his father and the Emperor himself. That perceived weakness was his strength, and that was his compassion. I can accept the argument that the circumstances in his life had resulted in him abandoning this nature for bitterness and self-loathing, but I can't accept that when he is faced front on his own sister's mortal danger, that he is still unmoved. I feel the character, like much of the film, was written into a cartoonish parody version of what it could have and should have been. The insertion of more characters into the plot, where others are killed off with no credence given their deaths, like Admiral Akbar, just continues to suggest that this team cares little for what has come before. Admiral Holdo is a role I feel completely useless and should have been serviced by Leia's character, giving her the heroic sacrifice play, which in hindsight seems like a huge missed opportunity. I also feel that the friction between Holdo and Poe Dameron would have been better served if it had been between Han and Leia. I mean, between Poe and Leia, given their established relationship. But no, as is apparent with this trilogy, more characters will just be thrown at it instead of real development, as evidenced by Benicio del Toro's complete waste of a character. I can't help but feel, especially in the wake of the divisiveness of The Last Jedi, that the team at Disney will set out to retcon the retcons established in this film. The apparent revelation that Rey's parents are nobody important will, I feel, likely be retconned. I fail to believe that her being of no significant heritage was the original intention, given how much like a Skywalker they made the character in every aspect. She was naive and exuberant, much like Luke and Anakin when we first come across them, living a life of restriction and isolation. A natural with mechanical and piloting skills. Naturally strong with the Force, with a desire to do good and a susceptibility to being drawn toward the dark side. Hell, they even styled her to look like Leia, Padme, or Shmi. Add to that, the revelation of her parentage was divulged by Kylo Ren, who not only is a duplicitous fiend, but is also fairly suspect in actually having any real knowledge of such things. I can accept, pardon me, I'd also like to point out in relation to that, when Disney took control of the Star Wars properties and decided to make the expanded universe stories legends, they essentially gave themselves carte blanche to take elements of those stories that they liked and use them in their future canon stories. This is abundantly apparent with their characterization of Ben, Kylo, and Rey. The two characters couldn't be much closer to that of Jason and Jaina Solo in the extended universe if they tried. Of course, they may not end up being siblings, but I wouldn't completely rule it out at this point either. Add to that, Rey wasn't always intended to be named Rey in the story either. Concept art from early in the development process has revealed that her character at one point was to be named Kira, shown swimming through underwater wreckage that strongly resembled the Death Star. This is interesting and at least strongly coincidental, as Kira and Kylo could easily be compared to Jason and Jaina. Then we also know that Kira as a name was likely just repurposed as Kira in the Solo movies as Han's love interest. Add to this the apparent inclusion in The Rise of Skywalker of Death Star wreckage, and I would still hold that the likelihood of the two being closely related is strong. This brings me back to my main point, and I apologize for the extremely long-winded nature of this letter. The creative team at Disney Lucasfilm appears from the outside to have no overall plan or vision with what they are doing with the films and the property on as a whole. We seem to get weekly reports in the media of them changing their minds in what they are developing and what they aren't any longer. As much as I'm critical of the execution of the films they have put out, I am still thankful that Star Wars films, TV, games, and what have you are being made. I would just prefer if there was someone with great care for the properties and characters was involved in a position there to ensure the quality of the output. I'd like to think that many of the issues that have plagued these sequel films won't be present in moving on to entirely new prospects in the Star Wars universe, as they won't have to deal with established characters and plot from previous installments, which should free the writers, directors, and so forth on being able to create something entirely new and exciting that we haven't seen before. I'll temper my expectations for now, however, because I'm given little in the way of an inclination that this will be the case. I'd like to finish off by expressing my appreciation for the channel and how you've created a great environment to express ideas and retrospect with intelligent insight that affords the possibility to expand our horizons. This is truly a breath of fresh air for someone like myself who finds it difficult to find other souls with the aptitude to discuss such topics with the depth and insight of which I desire, whilst being open-minded and bringing their own valid points to the table. I feel we all truly get with this, the Post-Geek Singularity, and are indebted to you, Rob, for providing such an outlet. I honestly get the impression that you and I could get together and talk for hours over all things geek and film over a bite and some drinks, and would love to do so sometime when I can make it over to the other side of the world. For now, I'll just relish in hearing the letters of the regulars, such as the esteemed Willow Yang or Rob from Long Beach, Paul from Long Beach, and keep tuning in for the next informative installment. Be sure and give Gilbert and Tallulah a cookie each on my behalf also. Yours sincerely, Aaron B. And Aaron B, okay, here's the reason I read this extremely long letter, and I'm sorry I might have not read it as well as I I hoped, is that one, I agreed with most of his points, but I wanted to use it as a jumping off point to sort of explain at least how I understand how Hollywood works from my experience. Disney, when they acquired Star Wars, they were not thinking, hey man, we're going to make, a trilogy of movies. They were thinking, of course, we want to spend the next 50 years making Star Wars movies. That's what Bob Iger was thinking. But believe it or not, it was a huge risk. They've spent $4 billion and change on Star Wars. What they needed to do was make a Star Wars movie. Remember that we think of it now, of course, it was going to be a trilogy. Why wouldn't they do it that way? But that's not how studios think. I mean, you'd think after Lord of the Rings, why wouldn't all studios be developing a trilogy at the same time? They can't. They can't do that because of how much money they would be committing. It is a wonder. It is a wonder. One of the great moments, or one of the great mysteries of my life, and we never got to get this interview when we were working on the Lord of the Rings discs, is I always wanted to interview Bob Shaye, who was he was last on Peter Jackson's stop. Peter Jackson was going to fly home to New Zealand and pull the plug on the two movies that they were going to make for Miramax, and Lord of the Rings was never going to happen. His last stop was Bob Shaye. And when Peter Jackson showed him the 5-minute Weta presentation on everything they were doing on Lord of the Rings, they were going to make two movies. Bob Shaye said, aren't there 3 Lord of the Rings books? And somehow was all in. I always wanted to know, Bob, what made you decide to take that risk? But I think in his mind, probably it had something to do with the fact that here were 3 beloved fantasy novels with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you really wanted to do Lord of the Rings correctly, just adapt the books, which seems totally intuitive, but probably wasn't what happened. But with the Star Wars movies, when Disney spent that money, they had to prove, they had to mitigate that risk. They had to make a Star Wars movie that would make a big splash, but they never thought, and on a spreadsheet, what they were thinking about is, we need new blood. Every franchise, they're always thinking, who can we get to how do we make this palatable for a younger audience? I mean, Star Wars, remember, Star Wars came out in 1977. It's almost half a century old. So how do you do that? How do you as a studio mitigate your risk? You can't even think about making 3 movies. You have to focus all of your energies, and to make one movie. I mean, now we think it's crazy, but studios aren't going, well, Star Wars fans are, we hope they're there. They don't know. The people that are running the studios don't know. There's nobody who has a job, except maybe Bob Iger, who knows. None of the people that are working at studios will ever come out and say, we need to do this. Because if it's wrong, they're out of a job. So nobody, amazingly enough, you have to understand, more than anything, most of the people that work at motion picture studios, and I can tell you because I worked in feature production, so I walked around in the corridors, literally the corridors of power for Warner Brothers. I could go into anybody's office, I could talk to anybody, and I did, because I was 22 years old, and I'm like, isn't this cool? I would use my enthusiasm. People were like, maybe I didn't think I was overbearing, but I would ask questions, and everybody likes to answer questions. All you have to do is you ask interesting questions of people that they will answer, and everybody will answer questions about their job, about what they do. If as long as you're aware of how you can ask a question and get out before you're too overbearing. And that's what I did. But it was really interesting to watch. It was very apparent to me that nobody there, you can't actually, it's like, do we have a consensus? Everybody at the studios are mitigating their own risks, because nobody wants to be the one that said yes to something that fails. So think about that. We as fans, we believe that we know what's right. As fans, we think don't we? Don't we all think we know what's right? Of course we do. We think we know exactly what's right. I certainly know I could run the Star Wars or Star Trek franchise. Give me the Star Trek franchise, I'll make great Star Trek. No problem. I'll cut the price of Discovery in half and make it twice as better show. I know I can do that. No one's going to give that job to me. You know, they're just not. And I think that it's interesting that we have these conversations, and they're never going to go away in fan circles. But you know what? If somebody spent $4 billion and you're the one looking down the barrel of a gun, and that gun is going to hit you in the face and blow your head off if you don't make the right decisions, you're going to mitigate your risk. What do? You hire JJ Abrams, who's a beloved figure in Hollywood, who everybody likes, creates TV shows that are big hits, whether it's Felicity, whether it's Alias, all the way through Lost and Person of Interest, and is also making big Star Trek movies, Mission Impossible films. He's worked on franchise properties. He is a safe bet, a beloved figure. You hire him to work with Lawrence Kasdan, who wrote Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Empire Strikes Back, arguably the greatest Star Wars movie. To this day, still the greatest Star Wars movie. Talk about mitigating your risks. You can't go wrong. You can't go wrong with this. And that's what they did. Nobody was thinking about, we have to beat out 3 movies, because they couldn't. They just couldn't. Nobody would, in no universe would they commit that much money after spending $4 billion. They had to hang back, and they're like, well, we've done everything we can to bring Star Wars back in a big way. We got the original characters back. The mistake that was made, though, if any mistakes were made, the mistake that was made was, we need to pass the torch off in this first movie. This was probably a decision that came from up high. Maybe the original Michael Arndt script that Lucas was developing, or something, that this is what they were going to do. They were going to make the films for a new generation of people. And on one hand, that makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. But on the other hand, Star Wars, it's the Skywalker saga. And every Star Wars fan, the idea was to see Luke, Han, Leia, 3PO, Chewie, Lando. Where are they now? Now, we think right now that would be the obvious choice. But when you spend $4 billion, it's not. On a spreadsheet, the safe bet would be to reinvent your Star Wars franchise with new characters, because why would kids, I mean, Harrison Ford, guys like your grandpa, can you have a Solo? Can you have Han Solo and bring it back that kids are going to relate to? Well, my answer to that would be yes. What you do is you make the first of these new trilogy films about our characters now, and you introduce new characters in relation to our core previous or our core original trilogy characters, if you have them. And I think it was a big mistake. And I think our letter writer is absolutely correct. I really think that Aaron, he has a great, very cogent analysis of where the films were at. But you have to understand how Hollywood works. They had to introduce these new characters. They had to give everybody new, at least on a spreadsheet, because you'd need somebody to put their job, and not only their job, but their entire future. If somebody made a Star Wars movie, if the first Star Wars movie, if The Force Awakens failed, it would have been the biggest, most epic failure in the history of Hollywood. So there was no way you're going to get a maverick vision behind doing a film. They had to do things based on algorithms and thoughts and marketing. They had to make it the safest movie it could be. As Aaron pointed out, it turned out to me to be a plotless regurgitation that really doesn't have a central story. But it made $2 billion. So whatever you think of The Force Awakens as a movie, they won. They won. And so all of from their perspective, from Disney's perspective, they won. And we're talking about these movies from a fan perspective. As long as the movies are grossing a lot of money, that's what they set out to do. Now, are they satisfying movie-going experiences? I don't think so. Again, I liked Luke's story in Last Jedi, but it was sort of like you said, Aaron eloquently put it, it was not necessarily warranted. Now, all of this, the reason I wanted to read Aaron's letter was it leads into this idea of Michelle Rejwan, who, I probably said her name, who has now been hired to be the senior vice president of live action development and production. But before we get there, I'm going to see where you guys are at in the chat room. And let's see where we are here, because I've seen a lot of interesting stuff coming down the pike. So let's start out with Echo Base Network. Echo Base Network is here. Echo Base Network says, the one thing I'm not hearing about this Lucasfilm hire is, does she know the source material and is she a fan of it? That's what is most important to me and a lot of other fans, not that she is a woman. I normally side with you over Campea about just everything, but I think John was leaning towards the fandom menace side of things today. Well, I haven't consulted. I don't know what the fandom menace is saying. All I know is this, in my experience, and this was true when I was working at Warner Brothers as well, some of the most impressive executives that I have ever met in Hollywood, and I began my career working for women, were women in the business. I mean, when I was at Warner Brothers, Lisa Henson, Jim Henson's daughter, was the senior vice president of production there, just like Michelle. She was the senior vice president of production. She had graduated, if memory serves, this was 30 years ago, with a degree in comparative mythology from Yale. You walked into Lisa Henson's office and she had shelves full of comic books. She was, she knew her stuff. And she was an incredibly impressive woman. And truth be told, I had a major crush on her. I'd go into her office literally every night, and she would let me come in because she was like the last person to leave. And I had a massive crush on her. She was, older than me, but because she was like the most powerful geek that I'd ever met. And she also put up with me and listened to me go on. But when Howard Chaykin would come in and pitch, say, a Grimjack movie to her, this is 30 years ago, she would ask me to give my opinion about what I thought of his pitch. I don't know if you ever knew that, but Howard Chaykin was, of course, one of my heroes, because American Flag is still one of my heroes. Howard Chaykin's American Flag is still one of my favorite comic book series of all time, and I am a huge Howard Chaykin fan. But anyway, here's what I've learned in Hollywood. Someone's credits don't necessarily have any bearing on what kind of a person is in terms of how they work and how capable they are of a hire. And I think what I mean by that is, okay, first of all, I want to talk about her experience. Let's see, her experience, her past experience. And as I've said to people, when you're working in Hollywood, you have to think of people's experience as a three-dimensional thing. Now, she started out in casting. She worked, she was a casting assistant on The Office back in 2005. She was a casting assistant on The 40-Year-Old Virgin. She was a casting assistant on Curb Your Enthusiasm. She also was an assistant on Curb Your Enthusiasm for 5 episodes. She was JJ Abrams' assistant on Morning Glory, on Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. And then she was a producer, of course, a co-producer on Star Trek Into Darkness, an associate producer on Super 8. And of course, she is the full producer on The Rise of Skywalker. When you are working in Hollywood, when you start out as, say, a director's assistant, you have to keep in mind that a director's assistant is not just sitting in a room as a typist getting the director coffee. When you are the assistant of a director like JJ Abrams, who's not just directing, but is producing and writing television, you are being exposed to every element, every facet of the motion picture business. And you are learning on the job. She had 15 years experience working. Now, I know a lot of people have said to me about my own career, and I can only use my own career as an example. When I was working in physical production at Warner Brothers as a management trainee, I was just learning. I was on movie sets. I was in executive offices. I was in the production offices of movies like Bonfire of the Vanities. I had my eyes open and my ears open, and I was learning infinite amounts that you could never quantify. And her experience is, I will tell you, she's learned more doing what she does for 15 years as being JJ's assistant and then working on these films as a producer and co-producer, whether it was Force Awakens, whether it was Super 8, whether it was Star Trek Into Darkness, which, remember, these are 150, $200 million movies. And at the same time, she's also still dealing with JJ Abrams television projects as well, and everything that Bad Robot was doing. What she was, the kind of work that she was doing, she was learning more about physical production. Remember, she has been hired as the senior vice president of live action production. And what was her first job, as John pointed out, as a full producer? She produced Rise of Skywalker, which was a film that has been challenged. It was challenging because it was made so quickly. She's coordinating this monster behemoth of a movie. So you've got to give it up for her. And what she has learned is probably, look, I've known producers on films that don't know the first thing about production. They're just content to get their name on as a producer. They don't want to be on a movie set every day. It's boring, but she has been in the trenches, in the shit, as I would say, for 15 years. And she's seen, I would call it, it's, how Khan didn't have two-dimensional thinking or three-dimensional thinking because he'd never captained a starship before. So he wasn't thinking about the X and the Y and the Z axis when he's fighting the Enterprise and the Mutara Nebula. Well, this girl, Michelle, I don't know her. I've never met her. I do know that where she was for the last 15 years has afforded her information to know and understand production from a very three-dimensional space that not a lot of people in Hollywood have had that experience. I know what that's like because, I've only directed one movie in my life, and that movie came out 20 years ago. However, I spent years being on the sets of movies like Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, X-Men 2, and Superman Returns. I was there every day in rooms with the director and the producer with a camera on for 10 and a half months. It was a masterclass in learning how to make a $200 million studio picture. And I got to be wherever I wanted to be. There was only a very few times when I was pushed out of the room because I wasn't supposed to hear what was going on. Of course, I was told right after that meeting anyway. So the amount of material that I got to learn in over the course of my career has been enormous. Now, I can only imagine when you're literally at the heart of the storm that Michelle Rejwan, I want to say, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but I think Rejwan's kind of cool. It's kind of a Star Wars name unto itself. They'll probably make Rejwan will wind up as a Star Wars character at some point. But the idea that people are crying about the fact that a woman such as Michelle Rejwan was hired to be the senior vice president of live action development and production. Remember, what is Lucasfilm doing now? They're developing motion pictures and they're producing live action Star Wars TV series concurrently. What was her experience for 6 years as JJ Abrams' assistant? She was watching motion pictures and live action television being produced concurrently. She has seen and managed that for 6 years while she was his assistant. And then because she was so good, she finally earned her stripes and was able to be as a producer. Now, here's the thing. People are like, oh, well, she was just the associate producer of Super 8. Well, I'll tell you something. She was at JJ Abrams' side, coordinating this, all different departments, doing what directors have to oversee. I mean, there are some people that get associate producer degrees just because they knew somebody who put up the money, but not her. She was there every day, fighting those battles, coordinating. She was not somebody who wasn't involved. And I'll bet you that if you sit down and talk to her, and I have no knowledge of this at all, I bet you that in talking to her for an hour, she's one of the smartest executives or smartest people you'll ever know or ever meet when it comes to how to produce live action television and movies. Now, her experience, Lucasfilm's experience with her on The Force Awakens, which now translates over to being a full producer on The Rise of Skywalker, would have proved that. Because I'll tell you something, there are very few people that come from the same place that she came from in terms of their experience. But you know what? For people that have never worked in Hollywood and have no real understanding of these titles and what they can possibly mean, of course they're going to come after her. They don't know shit. They don't know. But anybody who's worked in Hollywood for any length of time, or has worked in the executive arms of the studios, or has ever actually produced a film, it's readily apparent why Lucasfilm hired her. And I would suspect, again, don't know her, that she was one hell of a hire. And I think that for all of these, here's the problem. As much as I have enjoyed watching channels like the Fandom Menace, honestly, they don't know what they're talking about. I haven't seen anyone on those channels who are actual people that have worked in Hollywood or have themselves produced films. Have they worked at studios? Have they made $200 million movies? I don't think so. So when they're talking about these people, like, what do they know about Star Wars? Well, you know what? I think somebody who was put in this position knows a lot probably about Star Wars. I mean, look, and by the way, I'm certainly no JJ Abrams bad robot sycophant. I hated what they did with Star Trek, to be honest. I really, at least Star Trek '09 is palatable. Star Trek Into Darkness is one of the worst written and conceived science fiction films ever. And it's certainly a terrible, terrible Star Trek movie. And so I have no reason to defend anyone. I don't know these people. You know what? But as far as the studio system goes, I'll give her the benefit of the doubt, because she's busted her ass and worked her way up the system in 15 years, which is a lot more than a lot of people I've met who are producers of movies can say. So I'd say wait, because you know what? With The Mandalorian coming out, the Cassian Andor series happening, and whatever the third live action series is, I want somebody in a position of power as the senior vice president of production at Lucasfilm of live action who knows how to make sure that the trains come in on time. She's going to know. She's been there. She's been in the shit. But that's, again, just an opinion. I could be wrong. But anyway, Sujit is here. He says, let's chuck expectations for curiosity with Star Wars. That could be. I think Sujit, by the way, I love that you come here all the way from India. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Look, my problem is, as I've said, with any of these franchise properties, they cannot, there's no integrity. You cannot sit there and go, you just can't. They spent $4 billion. It's now a corporation that needs to justify their expenditure. Do you think Bob Iger cares about, he wants to make sure that he makes the Star Wars movie that's the safest, that's the most palatable? Give him a Star Wars greatest hits movie, because that's what I need. That's what I need to justify my investment. They made $2 billion off that movie. Big epic win. It had to be. Had to be. I mean, we as fans, their desire to make money doesn't translate with us who Star Wars we've internalized and since we were kids. You got to understand where they're coming from. And you know what? Knowing that, I'm always hoping that maybe we'll get maybe the Weiss and Benioff films will be good. Maybe the next Star Wars standalone movie will be good. I know from the Mandalorian's creative, the fact that Werner Herzog is a character in the Mandalorian show, I'm putting all of my Star Wars hopes and dreams in the Mandalorian basket, because I think we're going to get a kick-ass show out of that, because I trust the creators who are doing that, because it's already crazy. That long clip where you see the Mandalorian get a job from Werner Herzog, oh, that was awesome. Come on, dude, Gonk Droid. I had more fandom. I had my fandom tickled more from that clip from the Mandalorian than anything I've seen from The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi. I think they're on the right path. And if we get a Mandalorian TV series that kicks ass and gives us the kind of Star Wars we want, all will be forgiven. Because in my mind, Disney Star Wars, they needed to mitigate their risk. They needed to make sure it was going to, I mean, they spent $1 billion on Galaxy's Edge. And of course, it's a big hit too. But think about it. You've got to start thinking in terms of put your business cap on. You got to do it. You got to do it when you're making these decisions. Don't just think like a fan, think like a business person, and find out that somewhere in the middle of it all, you wind up with a creed. One day we're going to get the creed of the Star Wars movies. We're going to get a fan that gets into a position of power and really figures out how to thread that needle. Ryan Coogler went and convinced Sylvester Stallone to come on board and got the guy a Best Supporting Actor nod. We're going to get it. Factual Opinion is here. Factual Opinion says, I want a Captain Atom movie. Please, WB. I love Captain Atom. I have that entire run when they brought Captain Atom back. I love that character. I'd love to see them do a Captain Atom movie. I don't know if they ever will, but who knows? Anthony Trujillo says, you watched The Dark Crystal. It was worth it. Um, yes, it was. Yes, it was. I love The Dark Crystal. You know, I haven't watched it in a long time, and I know it's out on Blu-ray now, and I don't believe I bought the Blu-ray. I need to go pick it up because I haven't revisited it in years and years. Factual Opinion comes back and says, ever tried magic mushrooms? It's wonderful. Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you when I first tried magic mushrooms. So before I went to USC, I went to this college called the Evergreen State College. And they used to have this big event all weekend long called Super Saturday at the end of the school year. And because Evergreen was Evergreen, out in the woods, they had a gigantic iron pot where they would brew magic mushroom tea. And a lot of people would just go out there and trip balls all weekend. And that was the first time I ever had magic mushroom tea. And it was wonderful and it was crazy. And then I actually ate mushrooms later a couple of times, but I was it made my stomach upset. So not a big mushroom fan. But yes, I mean, magic mushroom tea, always interesting. JB Bonifacio says, I respect Kathleen Kennedy and her past successes, but she fought hard for Canto Bight being in The Last Jedi. Maybe not the best person to guide Star Wars. Well, here's the thing, everyone. I mean, you know what? If they had rejiggered the story of Last Jedi and put the Canto, if the movie opened in Canto Bight and you didn't have them leaving in the midst of a chase, and it just added to the ticking clock. I mean, they could have restructured that movie, and I think it would have worked better. But you know, everybody looks at it now. When they're making movies, they're not thinking to themselves. They're assuming all of this is going to work. They signed off on it, and they hoped it worked. Sometimes it just doesn't work. You know, movies do have an element of alchemy in them as well. And one of the things you got to give it up is that Rian Johnson had a vision. Kathleen Kennedy supported his vision. And from Kathleen Kennedy's perspective, she had a great experience working with him. The finished movie made $1.3 billion. It was the #1 grossing film that came out that year. It was a win. People, it was a win. Start thinking from a business perspective. Take your fan cap off and put your Star Wars butthurt aside and ask yourself, if you were an executive at Disney and you made a Star Wars movie that made over $1 billion, and don't tell me that, well, you know, Force Awakens made $2 billion. Force Awakens was an anomaly. It was an anomaly. Not more than $900 million domestic. It's an anomaly. Any movie that grosses over $1 billion on the spend that they made on Last Jedi, for the amount of money they spent on it, even if it was a $200 million movie, even if it was a $300 million movie, which it wasn't, but if it was, even probably with marketing, it was close, but a $300 million movie, $1.3 billion, that's a huge success. It's a success. Put your business caps on and go, hey, Last Jedi was a success. Did I particularly like it? Perhaps not, but it was a money-making movie. And in Hollywood, that's any discussion you have with Star Wars, if you're not talking about Last Jedi and first clarifying your point of view by saying, I understand this movie made money, your fan theories or your fan opinion does not matter. It is moot. No one cares. Because in Hollywood, all they care about is making money. Do you think if The Last Jedi didn't make money, then that's a different thing. We let the fan base down. But you know what? It made money. So whatever your problems with Last Jedi are, and by the way, I don't disagree with people's opinions on Last Jedi. I don't. Everything, as Aaron wrote, everything that he talked about with Last Jedi, I agree with, honestly. I do. I agree with it. But from a money-making perspective, you cannot deny the movie made money. It just did. And that's an epic win for everybody involved. 2 movies now, you're talking over 2 movies made $3.5 billion collectively on whatever they spent on them. That's some good stuff, man. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of cheddar. That's a lot of success. So anyway, Dan V900 says R2D2 has been treated horribly, like a useless relic with cameos, and BB-8 can do absolutely anything. Controlling the walker in The Last Jedi annoyed me greatly. One of the great injustices that has happened in motion picture history is the absolutely horrible treatment of R2D2. R2D2, the hero of 6 previous movies, who literally had a tarp thrown over him in The Force Awakens, a tarp thrown over R2D2, and we're supposed to believe that he turned himself off. This, of everything, the most egregious crimes that have been committed by the new trilogy of movies, the treatment of R2D2 is perhaps the most despicable. And I get it. Marketing. You can put a red arm on C-3PO. You can put a rectangular dish on the Millennium Falcon. And we want a new cute droid. I get it. I understand. You got to make that marketing cheddar after all. But you know what? The treatment of R2D2 is unforgivable. It's unforgivable. It's like what would have happened if beyond Sonny Corleone that either Fredo or Michael had died by the hands of one of the members of the 5 families. And then I do not forgive. If my son should get struck by lightning. R2D2, it's a horrible travesty and one of the worst things that's ever happened in Hollywood history. I'm right there with you, Dan. Terrible. Alexander Wilson says, did you read the Hollywood Reporter's expose on Men in Black International? It looks like another movie doomed from conception that people ask why they flop. Then people ask why they flop. For those of you who don't know, we talked about this on the JOHN CAMPEA show as well today. There was an expose about the Hollywood Reporter that was written yesterday about producer Walter Parks, who, by the way, Lawrence Lasker and Walter Parks were on my radar since War Games. They wrote War Games. They also wrote Sneakers. Walter Parks wrote Sneakers, and now he's been a producer. He's a producer on the original Men in Black movie. It is a cautionary tale, folks, a cautionary tale of how Hollywood movies can go horribly awry. One of the most important relationships that exists on any movie set are between the physical producer, whether he's creative, whatever, the lead producer on a movie that's going to be working in tandem with the director. Here's how Hollywood should work. A great producer believes in his hires, believes in his director, believes in his actor, believes in his cinematographer, believes in the entirety of the rest of his crew. And a great producer then facilitates the vision of the director. Everything is being filtered through the director. And their relationship is key to making sure that a movie is well made. Key. Now, if there's a problem, if the producer wants to express his opinion or her opinion, it is essential that you have to put on a united front for the rest of your crew, and especially your actors. There is nothing worse. There is nothing more destructive than knowing that the producer and a director are at loggerheads or at odds. You never want that to happen. So, pro tip to anybody who wants to produce movies, make sure that if you have a problem with your director, you do not make this public knowledge. And if you want to read the article about Men in Black, Walter Parks had final cut on the movie. Well, he should know better. I mean, and of course, there was nobody at Sony. The executive left. There was a lot of things that went wrong on that film. And you know what? Ultimately, the film is compromised, just like Hellboy. We have 2 cautionary tales about how producing relationships can go awry. You have Hellboy with Lloyd Levin, and you have Walter Parks and Men in Black, at least as it's been reported. Remember, there are 3 sides to every story. There's one sides, there's the other sides, and there's the actual truth. And so when you read these stories about, oh, you can't place the entirety of the blame on whatever you read about. But I'll tell you, after reading the fact that a producer has final cut on a movie, that's not exactly something that is unique in Hollywood history. But, you know, what you would hope is that a producer and a director are working toward the same vision. And it was clear this was not happening. A producer is rewriting. I mean, that was part of his deal too. I mean, it was the way the deal was structured. they were doomed anyway. And F. Gary Gray was going to leave, and the actors brought in their own writer. It was a disaster. It should never have happened. I mean, it's studio filmmaking going awry, ridiculous. And you know what? They paid for it. I think that's on the studio, and it's on Walter Parks because he knows better. Suthius says, "Hey, Mr. C, Star Trek, Star Wars, Power Rangers, Godzilla are all my jam, and I've enjoyed every single new iteration of them in the past decade. I always go in fresh-minded, and I don't compare them to the past." Well, Suthius, I do too. For those of you who go, "Oh, come on, Rob," I always want everything to be great because I know how hard it is to make these movies. It's really, really difficult. So I go in fresh-faced and bushy-tailed. I want everything to work. I do. I want it all to work out. I take no pleasure in when things don't work because that's a bummer. By the way, as an aside, I'd like to share another story with you since we're on this topic. So, of course, many people are bitching about the fact that Captain Marvel won an award at the MTV Movie Awards. It won Best Fight Scene. I know a lot of people think at the end that maybe the battle from Endgame, when the portals open, I guess we call it the portals scene, should have absolutely won. But I think when they say fight scene, we're talking mano-y-mano or woman-y-woman, chica-y-chica, I don't know. So anyway, Captain Marvel won this award at the MTV Movie Awards, and Brie Larson was on hand to accept. But you know what she did? In what I would say, a baller move. Captain Marvel star Brie Larson, this is reported on Yahoo Movies. I'm reading this from Yahoo Movies. Captain Marvel star Brie Larson shared her MTV Movie Award last night with her stunt doubles, bringing them on stage with her to pick up the gong for Best Fight Scene. Ingrid Kleining and Joanna Bennett joined the 29-year-old actress to receive the accolade for the on-screen scrap between Carol Danvers and Gemma Chan's Minerva, with Larson explaining that she couldn't have done it without them. Okay, that's awesome. Good for Brie Larson. If you people want a reason to stop hating on Brie Larson, that was a baller move. I think good for you, Brie. That's what actors do. They give credit where credit is warranted. And I think that what she did there was pretty great. So good for her. I wholeheartedly approve. And yeah, I'm all into that. Let's see. I have another letter I would like to read because it's a good one. Well, actually, this is a quick one. This is from Dan Skip Allen. And Dan Skip Allen says, "I read an article today saying Quentin Tarantino wanted to have explicit language in his rumored Star Trek movie. Also, that it has been used in the past, so why not now?" Okay, first of all, everyone is saying that, Quentin Tarantino is going to drop the F-bomb a lot in his new Star Trek movie. Look, here's the thing. I think the Star Trek universe, Kirk said, "Hey, once double dumbass on you." Spock pointed out your use of colorful metaphors. I would say that perhaps bad language could be warranted in situations, but I also think that Starfleet officers have an element of decorum and respect in the way they treat other officers. And I think perhaps it's frowned upon to use that kind of a language. And I think, look, if you're going to be taken out by an errant motherfucker here or cocksucker there, perhaps it's not the best language to use in a Star Trek movie. It would seem very obtrusive, as we saw in Star Trek Discovery. But again, I wait and see. I can't imagine that Star Trek needs that kind of language, but it is Quentin Tarantino, and it really depends to me on context. Context is king. So there you go. At least that's what I think. I'll wait and see. I'm not worried about language. Now here's another letter from David Skip Allen that he also wrote. So here you go. This is another one, but it's since that one was short, I'm going to give David Dan. Why do I say David? It's Dan. It's Dan Skip Allen. Did I say David before? I don't know. I have some mental block, maybe from, I don't know why. It's Dan Skip Allen, and here's another letter from him. Hey, Rob, I just wanted to write you today to talk to you about the whole Captain Marvel thing. As you know by now, I'm a film critic in Florida. I'm a 45-year-old white man. I am who Brie Larson was talking about. Writing movie reviews for a website or newspaper has been a dream of mine ever since I was a little kid. I used to watch Siskel and Ebert at the movies as a child and into my young adult years. Before Gene Siskel died, later Roger Ebert died as well, but before he died, he had Richard Roeper replace Gene Siskel as his co-host on At the Movies. I wanted to be like them ever since I was a child. I actually went to a speaking engagement of Richard Roeper at the University of Central Florida in 2006. The one thing he said that I took away from his speaking engagement was this: you don't have to have a degree in journalism to be a film critic. All you needed was a YouTube account and Facebook page. I had both, so I started doing movie reviews. I've been doing them in one form or another since 2007. I agree with Brie Larson. We need more film critics of different genders and creeds and colors. It's always good to get different kinds of opinions from people of different walks of life. That being said, I didn't like Captain Marvel that much. I read or watched many reviews of the film, and I still don't agree that it's a good movie. It's an okay movie, in my opinion. I feel it's too convoluted. They were trying to do too much, what I call too many cooks in the kitchen. I did like the cast, though, but they were just trying to do too much, and it didn't work for me. Like JOHN CAMPEA says, all film is subjective. I don't have any problems with anyone who likes the film. I know you like it, Rob, so good for you. Thanks. Talk to you later. Keep up the great work. Dan Skip Allen. Sorry, not Dave. It isn't Dave. I said Dan Skip Allen. P.S. Could you talk about a couple of your favorite sports films? I never hear you talk about sports movies. I would like to, though. I know this is very different from my letter. Well, Dan, I actually have a thing for sports movies. Even though I don't watch a lot of professional sports, I do love sports movies. The same way that I don't know much about being a cop, but I love movies about cops. I mean, give me a Serpico, or give me a Prince of the City, or give me, well, To Live and Die in LA is about the Secret Service. Give me The French Connection. I love movies about cops. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite books of last year was Don Winslow's book, The Force, about corrupt cops in New York. It's awesome. But anyway, favorite sports movies. There's a great football movie called North Dallas 40 with Nick Nolte and Mac Davis. I love Slapshot. I love Any Given Sunday. Of course, I love The Natural. I love the original Bad News Bears. Those are, I guess, some of my favorite sports movies. I mean, and of course, the original Rollerball, Norman Jewison's Rollerball from 1975. It is, in fact, a sports movie. You can't say that it's not. Now, this next letter, it's a short one, but it comes from one of my favorite listeners who never ceases to crack me up, Paul in Long Beach. Yes, indeed, Paul in Long Beach is back. He writes, "Morning, Rob. So last week, when you announced that Mike had updated the 3-word review section of the Burnettwork.net website, I had to read a few. After noticing the fabulously follicled Connery, of course I had to click for Zardoz. Brilliant, Mr. McNulty. Brilliant. After a few others, to my surprise, someone added a Phantom Menace review as well. It was then that I spit coffee all over my computer. I backed away, and I gave your moderator, Terry Flynn, a gigantic round of applause. In fact, all weekend, whenever I've needed a little chuckle myself, I've said, Neeson's Rage Begins. That is top-notch, A-plus comedy, Terry. Thank you." I read a lot of Terry. Terry, of course, is one of the great moderators here at the Burnettwork on Robservations, and he contributed a number of 3-word reviews that were hilarious. But Neeson's Rage Begins, I have to say, was inspired, and I like that Paul in Long Beach, one of our great comedians here at the Burnettwork and also at Robservations, if we had a ringing endorsement like that from Paul, that is some funny stuff that's going on. Let's see. And by the way, I encourage everybody to go to the Burnettwork.net website and submit your 3-word reviews. We need them because I think they're hilarious. And the more interactivity we can have on the website, the more fun it is for everybody. So why not? Right? Let's see. Suthius is also back with, he's got a multi-part question. Suthius says, in regards to Rejwan, sometimes it's not just about experience, it's also about the ability to multitask and lead, which I would imagine she has that ability. I myself I'm reading all the 3 parts of your question. I myself had 10 years experience of security monitoring for a major financial company, but the guy who was new for a year, he became supervisor and consultant. He was the one who had leadership qualities and always knew how to handle and take control of chaos. Just because you have experience doesn't mean you're right for the position. So let's see what she can do in her new position. Well, first of all, Suthius, that is an incredibly astute observation. And I got to hand it to you. You immediately recognize somebody who had not better, but say a different set of skills than you did. And you recognize somebody's worthiness to be in the position that you were already in. You could recognize that. And that's true of people. You know, I've met people that are way better at doing things than I am. I like to consider myself, when you're making movies, a jack of all trades. But if somebody comes along and is way more talented and better than I am, here, take the position. There's nothing better than working with people that are more talented and better at their jobs than you could ever be. That's the great thing about working in movies, is that you can all find a place to work together, but you let the cream rise to the top. By the way, you know what the greatest quality of a producer that a producer can have is? A producer hires the very best people, provides a work environment, and provides the tools and the talent so people can create the best work that can be done. And then the producer just hangs back and then takes credit for the work at the end. And rightfully so, because they brought those people together, they brought the project in, and they allowed those people the space to do their jobs. What happens, and we see this with Walter Parks, and we saw this with what happened on Hellboy. You know, producers don't traditionally get all the accolades. It's directors and stars. I understand that. But you know what? If you're secure, like you're Jerry Bruckheimer, you sit back, you hire the best people you can, and for 40 years, he's kind of, hangs back. You still get to be Jerry Bruckheimer, because at some point somebody looks and recognizes it. Look at how many hit movies you've made, man. And you can never take that away from you. But a great producer finds the best material, hires the best people to make that, gives them the environment where they have everything they need to make the movie, and hangs back and lets the people who he hired to do their jobs. That's the best way to make films. Anyway, so Culture Inject says, VFX producer versus VFX supervisor, what is their job? Okay, well, that's an interesting question. So here's the thing. There's different kinds. I've answered a question like this before. But first of all, you have to talk about, when you say VFX, I would assume we're talking, VFX means visual effects, all right? A visual effects supervisor is in charge of overseeing all of the visual effects on a movie. Now, you might be coordinating 10 different vendors, say ILM, say Digital Domain, whoever, and all the other different visual effects companies all over the world. A visual effects supervisor also knows how all of these visual effects are created, and usually came from a position like a guy like Mark Stetson, who is one of the great visual effects supervisors working in Hollywood. If you go back and you look at his credits, he was building models on Star Trek: The Motion Picture and worked his way up. He understands how all visual effects are made. So a visual effects supervisor is the overall visual effects supervisor for everything on a movie. Now, a visual effects producer is somebody that's doing just that. They have to produce. You might have a visual effects supervisor who's a producer at all the different houses, producing whatever they're supposed to be doing, or a visual effects producer can be working underneath a visual effects supervisor and literally is on set. For instance, you know, I use an example on movies I've actually worked on: Chronicles of Narnia, Superman Returns, X-Men. There's always a visual effects supervisor and a producer who are on set, or maybe Mark wasn't on set, but the visual effects producer would be. So say you're shooting elements of green screen elements of Superman flying. The visual effects producer might be there and making sure those elements are photographed correctly. The lighting is what the house, the effects house is going to need. So that's basically how that works. It's a good question, Culture Inject. Suthius is back. Did I say Mr. C? Oops, my bad, homie. You could call me Mr. C. You know, who am I to say what you want to call me? But I want to appreciate you supporting the channel. That's very nice of you, all the way from India. I think that's very cool that you guys are here all the way from India. I have another letter. And you know what? It comes from Dieter Bastian. And I just noticed this. Dieter Bastian is a longtime viewer, a longtime member of the Post-Geek Singularity community. Dieter Bastian's email is Ford Fairlane. And maybe I've said this before, but that's The Adventures of Ford Fairlane, which starred Andrew Dice Clay as Ford Fairlane. Ford Fairlane was directed by Rennie Harlan, and it was a film that was deeply compromised from its final version. I think the director's cut, they cut a half an hour out of it. I went to a screening where I saw the film. It was a half an hour longer than what got released, and I loved Ford Fairlane. That's just an aside. Dieter says, Dieter here. Even if I don't want to beat the dead horse topic of Kathleen Kennedy again, I would like to chime in, since you, Rob, had nothing better to do than list her impressive resume on 2 shows. And like R&B tells us every time, it's not show friends, it's show business. I think it's also, what have you done lately in Hollywood, and not what have you done in your past. Let's make an apple to oranges comparison. If in my workplace I would produce 50 wrong pieces today, which couldn't be assembled for selling, nobody would say, but he's produced 200,000 good pieces before that. It would just be that you dropped the ball yesterday, and that perhaps it would even come with a warning. So let's look at what Kathleen Kennedy has done lately. She produced a flop in Solo. And by the way, that movie was bland and boring. I can bitch and moan about Star Wars The Last Jedi the whole day long. Solo wouldn't even give me that satisfaction. Forgotten in T-1 day, like Jeremy Johns would say. It wasn't even visually appealing. It was like, we have no more money for big reshoots, bring in the fog machines to hide everything, or lay blue or brown filters over the picture to create some sort of style. But you know me, Rob, I'm a hypocrite. Of course I own the movie on Blu-ray twice, and would even consider buying Envy's Nest hot toy figure, since I liked her Mad Max style. But it has to come with the speeder. Luckily, Hot Toys is only sitting on their Solo figure. I'm still interested in what the Lord Miller movie would have been. Couldn't have been worse, I guess. But back to Kathleen Kennedy. Produced a flop. Didn't invite famous internet people to Galaxy's Edge. Okay, that's not on her. But fired or exchanged directors, and of course produced The Last Jedi, which, like no Star Wars movie, had the fan base in uproar more than ever before since the Jar Jar days. Let's look at the business side of the movie. I know, Rob, you always say The Force Awakens was a novelty with over $2 billion at the box office. Nevertheless, The Last Jedi made $700 million less. I know, Rob, it was the most successful movie of its release year, yada, yada, yada. Yes, it was, but let me make the apples to oranges comparison again. If my company would make $700 million less of a profit in a year following a record prior to that, no matter how positive you're still in the green, you can rest assured there would be talks, because let's face it, in our society, it always has to be more, 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 with a rebel yell, I might add. Consider this, Rob. Endgame will have made around $700 million more than Infinity War after its theatrical run. Crazy. Let's say, just for argument's sake, that it would have made $700 million less, which would be not much more than Captain Marvel alone did. Once again, you still could say it's the most successful movie of the year right now, and it would have made a profit. But hand on heart, Rob, wouldn't you be a little disappointed if it went that way and luckily not the other way around? I could be wrong, because the film business is a fickle thing, but I believe that trend down will continue with episode 9. Don't know how JJ can save the train wreck. The hate for The Last Jedi is still alive and well, and all of the fandom menace society will have written their rants for the rise of Skywalker already. Gotta have those clicks, man. Even the great RMB couldn't resist to bring the Kathleen Kennedy topic back to the forefront again twice. So let's see what Rob has done lately. I don't see him as this failed filmmaker because I haven't even seen Free Enterprise. Sorry, Rob. You should watch the German dub of Free Enterprise. It's apparently hilarious. I won't buy DVDs anymore unless you can get this 4K 3D conversion remastering autographed limited steelbook 3-disc edition out in stores on your website. I still have to pass. I can't get the movie in Germany for streaming, and let's face it, I will have it as a physical thing, not a digital file. I'm working on that, by the way. Back to what has Rob done lately. He has almost daily guest appearances on the JOHN CAMPEA Show, the only reason to watch it anyway, and has created his own YouTube channel where even a German douchebag can rant. He won't get mad at him. I hope. Rob just put him in his place as always, spits his positive venom over the internet ether, and let the geek cool down so that his world can be normal again. And for that, Rob, thanks. Live long and prosper. Your German douchebag, Dieter. I love you guys. I love you girls. I love all of you people. Well, first of all, Dieter, I'd also like to say that I am finishing up. I'm still producing the movie Tango Shalom that I also edited, and I'm in the midst of post-supervising. And we have the last of our ADR sessions starting tomorrow. And I'm going to announce this. I don't know if I've actually announced this, but in the movie, Moses appears. And when they shot Moses, they shot him at Vasquez Rocks, where, of course, they've shot many Star Trek episodes, many different things. So they shot Moses without the actor without sound. So it was MOS, mid-out sound. When they shot Moses, guess who does the voice of Moses in Tango Shalom? That's right, me. And when I was putting together the movie, since there was no sound there, I actually recorded my dialogue on my iPhone because I have this software where you can record pretty good dialogue. I didn't have this microphone when I did it. It just stayed in the movie because the director thought my delivery was funny. So this Thursday, I am actually going into an ADR booth, which is automatic dialogue replacement, and I'm going to record for real my lines as Moses for Tango Shalom. So I would say that my track record, I basically get to produce a movie every 10 years. And yeah, there's a lot of people that probably wouldn't give me the time of day or would judge me by a movie I directed 20 years ago. But I'll tell you something. I have a lot of the same three-dimensional experience our friend Michelle has, who's now been promoted to the senior vice president of production at LucasFilm. I think people could do a lot worse than to hire me for a high-ranking position, because I guarantee you I would do the job, and I would do it in an A-list, A-plus fashion. But again, I'm not looking for those jobs because I need to finish this one movie first and direct another movie. And I've got to get Free Enterprise out in 4K, which I'm really hoping to do. We'll see. Anyway, Dieter, you know what? You can always write to me, sir, because I appreciate always having your opinion, and you crack me up. Now, here's a new letter. And this one comes from Brad Haga. Brad says, "Hi, Rob. This is my first letter to anyone in a very long time, so I'll try to be coherent. Back in my college days, I used to work at fan conventions. I got to meet a lot of very interesting people there. Writers, actors, visual effects people, and some very talented and passionate fans. Back then, Walter Koenig, James Doohan, and Mark Leonard were sort of the three musketeers of fandom, going to conventions together all over the world. They'd talk about Star Trek, their latest stage productions, war stories, you name it. I got to meet Yvonne Craig, Batgirl in the 60s. Oh, yeah. And she was a sweetheart. Everybody laughed at her story about the time she ran over Vincent Price's foot with the Batgirl cycle. Later, we got to know the Babylon 5 crew, especially the late Richard Biggs. He was great. He came to an event I was a producer on. And they liked us enough to put out a name on a ship, the Roanoke, of which, of course, got blown to bits. We were one of the first few conventions that Majel Barrett came to after her husband, Gene Roddenberry, died. She talked about him and told stories to anyone who would listen. and you could tell that she was still in such pain, but soldiering on. We came to know these people and many others. They were friends. In a sense, they were family. This is why it always saddens me to see others treating actors and creators as if they're not even really people. I may have issues with a given character, but that should never translate to the actors that portrayed them. These are people doing a job, an often fascinating and storied job, often with little control over what they're called upon to deliver. Kelly Marie Tran did a fine job of portraying Rose Tico, even if the writer and director did the role few favors. People need to remember that an acting role is like a mask, and there's always a person, just like you and me, underneath it. Well, Brad Haga, thank you for that letter, and I certainly think that is a sentiment we all should remember. Whatever side of fandom you're on, whether you're part of the fandom menace or whether you're part of the post-geek singularity, we got to remember that it's people that are making the things that we love. People that put thousands of hours of their time, thousands of hours of their blood, sweat, and tears, and their efforts and their creativity. Everybody is trying to make the movie or the television show or the comic or the novel or the video game. Everybody is trying to make something to the best of their ability, because that's why they're doing it in the first place. So we have to remember that. And yes, I mean that even about the people that make Star Trek Discovery. Let's see if there is anyone else here, because this chat's gone on. This is kind of an epic, this is an epic chat. Dan V900 says, I just sent you a DM that you can read on air if you want, with something that was nagging me from the long letter earlier in regards to the EU. Well, Dan, since you put it that way, I will. Dan sent me. I like this. I like when you as an addendum to your super chats, you contact me via super chats and tell me to go onto Twitter. Hang on, I'm going to do just that and read your DM. Whenever I go off Twitter, I have to, because I had somebody hack my Twitter once. I have to. You get a code. I have to get the Twitter code, kind of like the repo code. So let's see. Okay, let me go to my DM and read your letter, Dan V900. Dan Vakura, here you go. So here's what Dan says. I have a problem with a comparison people keep using for this trilogy compared to the extended universe, which stands for expanded universe, not extended universe. Okay, expanded universe. I wish people would get that right. I blame the DCEU. People like to mention Jason and Jaina with Kylo and Rey since it's easy because of Ben turning into Kylo along with Rey as the woman fighting him. They are very different with their motivations and personalities. Jason turned because every future he saw where he didn't kill another female Jedi resulted in him killing Luke. She wanted to turn in a discovered Sith who Luke fought in the past. He saw a happy future with that fellow Jedi where they would have had a good life. However, he loved his uncle and couldn't imagine killing him, where that Jedi had to be sacrificed for the greater good since he would not want to kill Luke. He was full of hubris, where he believed everything he saw after being on a 5-year journey learning from different types of Force users. Unfortunately, it led to his downfall, where his sister killed him and he used his last breath to warn the mother of his child about the threats on their lives. That's a better and more interesting motivation to turn than Ben, but that's just me. Well, Dan, thank you for that. I appreciate that. You know, it goes to, here's another thing that I don't think is really understood by fandom and also by Hollywood, because they pretend it doesn't exist. And I feel this way about Star Trek as well. I think if there's anybody out there that's controlling a large franchise property, one of the first things that should be done is, if it's Predator, if it's Alien, if it's Star Wars, if it's Star Trek, there has been so much expanded universe material that has already been written. And what happens is when you hire a guy like JJ Abrams to come on and write Force Awakens, JJ Abrams doesn't know anything about the extended universe or the expanded universe. He doesn't know. He hasn't been following these things. And what's interesting is that we as fans do, and there's this, and they live on in our heads. I mean, there were so many. What happened after Return of the Jedi was well documented, well documented. And whether it was video games or novels or comics. Now, I'm not saying that it was well documented in perhaps as good as it could have been, but it was documented. And in the mind, we knew these stories. So if you're going to go and create a movie like The Force Awakens, in my mind, I would think, well, we deserve a story that's at least as good as what's already been delivered to us through the various licensees. But there is a thing in Hollywood, they don't care. Anybody that's working in movies and television does not care what happened in a novel. In their minds, that's not real. It's not real. Only movies are real. If you work in movies and you're going to make a Star Wars movie, nothing that's ever happened before in the Star Wars universe matters except the previous 6 films. Nothing else exists. I always think that's wrong-headed. I thought that when they were going to make the first Alien versus Predator movie, AVP, I was like, wow, the Dark Horse comic, the first Dark Horse comic was pretty dope. And I'm thinking, there's a great basis for a movie. But if you're a screenwriter hired to write an Alien versus Predator movie, why the heck would you go back to a previously existing comic book, no matter how good it is, to adapt it? Because that's not your job. You've been hired, presumably, to come up with an Alien versus Predator film. No, I think what should happen is if you've bought a franchise property, you should look at the previously existing material if it's there and strip mine it. And I've been saying this for a long time. However, we saw in Star Trek Discovery this year that the latter half of season 2 was a big Section 31 story about their crazy AI called Control. Well, was it a coincidence that a couple of years ago that one of my favorite Star Trek novelists, David Mack, wrote a Section 31 novel called, wait for it, Control, which, by the way, was infinitely better than the gobbledygook they served us, the most rudimentary, ridiculous Z-grade look at AI that I've ever seen. And nobody went and looked at his book and even gave him credit. I mean, somebody looked at his book. And frankly, and there's been no reporting in any genre press about this, but it was pretty egregious, I think. But I think that franchise owners should go back and look at these things, because as far as Star Trek books are concerned, I remember Bob Orsi was talking about how the fact that the Reeves Stevens, excellent. If you want to read, there's this perception that Star Trek novels or any kind of fiction, any kind of tie-in fiction, are basically garbage. Well, Star Trek novels are not all of them, but for the most part, you've got novelists that have gone on to write great fantasy series on their own right, or in their own right, like Diane Duane, who one day I'm going to put out the Robservations episode with Diane Duane. She's an amazing novelist, and people wrote Star Trek novels in the first place because they loved Star Trek. It was only later that there were people. I mean, actually, that's not true. Anybody writing Star Trek fiction was trying to write great Star Trek because they loved it. And there's a number of excellent Star Trek novels. I mean, I've never understood why people don't then go back to previously existing novels, like you adapt, say, a Tom Clancy novel. Why wouldn't you ever go to a Star Trek novel and just adapt that novel? I mean, makes no sense to me. But anyway, the EU, Dan, I understand. I think one of the things people, what's interesting about the EU for Star Wars is that we already got really great stories about the kids that and what happened with Luke, Han, and Leia after Return of the Jedi. And at least they should have given us a movie that was as good as those books, or as good as what, maybe the books weren't so good, but the arc of those characters were pretty good. And they were developed over years. It wasn't something, but no one would do that because they have to go, make it the way they want it. Stubble McShave says, when I saw the Star Wars special edition in the theaters, Prince of Egypt was the trailer. 2 teen girls talked behind me. Hey, that's about Jesus. No, I mean Mozart. That's funny. I like that. Willow Yang says, I have a colleague who likes to hum songs from Prince of Egypt around the lab, only he doesn't know the lyrics, so he goes, meow, meow, meow. You're a party girl, Willow. By the way, I said hello to Willow Yang. I mouthed hello, Willow, when on the John Campea show, when John read one of Willow's super chats. It's really funny. I mean, I feel like if I was like married and I was having an affair, that like if Willow Yang was my side piece, whenever she comes on to the John Campea show, and she's always supportive and participates, when she comes on, I like have to pretend I don't know who she is. Because, you know, when she comes on the John Campea show, I have to pretend like, oh yeah, this girl doesn't have a page on my own website. So today I went, so yeah. So Willow Yang, that's how I feel. I always feel like if I don't acknowledge that we're in a relationship online or something like that, that you don't have, like that we don't have Willow talk on the Burnettwork.net, I feel like, you know, I'm not acknowledging you, just so you know. But, you know, on John's show, it's John's show. Anyway, Emmanuel Ericart says, Twitter shows that idiocracy is high verisimilitude. I don't disagree with you. I mean, Idiocracy is becoming Mike Judge's movie that he made after the Beavis and Butthead movie. Idiocracy was his live action debut, or was that after Office? He made it after Office Space, right? That Idiocracy is coming. Look, we're living in Idiocracy. I swear to God, we really are, and it's getting worse all the time. And it's kind of frightening. It really is kind of frightening. But since Stubble McShave wrote in, I'm trying to find, I have one last letter. I have one last letter, and I need to find it in this list. I know I have it. Let's see. Oh, no. I've got another letter I want to read that I haven't read. This one comes from Mark Scarbeck. Mark says, hi, Rob. Me again. Laugh out loud. I just wanted to say, first off, thank you for reading my first letter live on your show. It had my wife and I geeking out. Of course, she was just excited for me. It's so weird to think people would get excited when I read their letters. But I'm glad your wife was excited. I also want to thank you and your team for all of the great things that you do. That would also be part of the team. You got to give it up for Mike Bodden, who basically created the Burnettwork.net website, and my great moderators, Mike being one. You've got Terry, you've got Detective Jim, and Greg Smith. My condolences for John Zeller. I do understand his contemplation on suicide. I can't say my life has been the easiest. I suffer from social anxiety disorder, and I have my own bouts with depression. Although this is not what your channel is about, and I'm not in any physical pain or contemplating suicide myself, this kind of hits me in the heart. 14 years ago, my father had a massive stroke. Now, he did not pass away, but he can hardly walk and can't really form speech enough to have a conversation. Then when my wife and I came back from our honeymoon last year, we found out my father-in-law has stage 4 small cell lung cancer. The reason I'm saying this is not for sympathy or just to be heard on YouTube, but sometimes I tell my wife that at some point, her dad, after all the treatments and pain, the time may come where he just can't do it anymore and just lets go. If, God forbid, that time comes, I would like to ask your permission if I can share that letter with my wife. Feel free to read this live if you wish. I just thank you for what you do. When I'm having a bad day or just want to hear the last opinions on Kathleen Kennedy's ruining of Star Wars, you and the Post-Geek Singularity don't fail to commit. Laugh out loud. I think YouTube was sending me a sign when it recommended the John Campea show. Then I started following you. At the time, my father-in-law may pass. I don't know what to say, but the letter does help. No one should have to suffer. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Thank you for your time and all that you do. Your friend, Mark. P.S. If you ever come to the Philly, New Jersey area, let us know. I'd love to buy you a martini, shaken, not stirred. Well, you know what? I think it's going to come time, you know, when we get more subscribers here, if I ever do realize my ambition of I want to restore Free Enterprise and do a new cut of the film, which I would call the Final Frontier cut, which would be the last Free Enterprise cut, which I've actually done a version of using the old version. I've actually trimmed it up, and I'm going to make it, hopefully I'll be able to do that sometime soon. But it would be cool to do like what William Shatner did with Star Trek 2 and sort of travel around the country with William Shatner, show Free Enterprise, and then afterwards I could interview him on stage and then take audience questions. I think that'd be really, really a lot of fun. Hopefully I'll be able to do that. But, Mark, I really want to thank you for your letter. As I told people, John Zeller, who wrote to me as Dr. Kent Nelson a lot, I was very sad to hear that he passed away. And before he did that, a number of weeks before, he had asked me to talk about suicide on the channel. And I just, I talked to people about this, and I was conflicted about doing it because I am not obviously a mental health professional. And look, I used to tell people in high school, junior high and high school, I didn't want to be flippant about it, but there were a lot of people that would express suicidal thoughts and angst-ridden thoughts when you're young. And my answer to them would always be like, you can't die. You have to stick around because there's another Star Trek movie and we need to be around to watch it. Of course, that was before Star Trek V, The Final Frontier came out. Oh, anyway, not to joke. But John did pass away. He did take his own life. And I did talk to him since back in 2016. And he did bring up a lot of interesting points. And one day, maybe I should read all of what he had written me about the subject. But I really appreciate you saying that. And I hope you and your wife, let me just throw out some happy vibes to you and your wife. Hope all is well. Your marriage is fairly new. I mean, do you guys argue over movies and stuff? Write me and tell me, like, what do newly married members of the Geek Singularity do? Like, you've been married for like a year. What do you guys stream together? What are your favorite things to binge watch? Like, it was really cool. Elizabeth and I, we've been together for 4 years, and Elizabeth and I, we still do things like we got to go meet Jean-Pierre Jeunet because one of the reasons that we met was we met on OkCupid, and her profile talked about Amelie, and Amelie is one of my favorite movies. So Elizabeth and I bonded over Amelie. So we got to go last month and meet Jean-Pierre Jeunet, and I went and with her, and we got an original Amelie, a giant French Amelie poster. And Jean-Pierre Jeunet we were able to meet him, or she was able to meet him, and she talked to him in French, and her French name is Babette. Although I don't call her Babette, I call her Elizabeth. Although my friend Dave Hargrove calls her Liz. Hey, Liz, which I think is enormously entertaining. But so we got Jean-Pierre Jeunet to sign this poster to her. So we've got this, this mutual love affair for this movie that we can share. But what do you members of this? Oh, you know what? I'll just throw this out to everybody. Members of the Post-Geek Singularity community, what do you and your significant others share as imagination connoisseurs? What are things, and when you're married, when you're in a relationship, have there been things that you discover together that you become really passionate about, like whether it's TV shows or books or movies or video games, whatever? I mean, as couples, do you like have death matches on online, or do you play Grand Theft Auto online against one another just to kick each other's asses to blow off some steam? I mean, what do you guys do? I want to hear. Maybe we'll put a section on the website. You can this will be a new exploration of these things. Which could be kind of cool. But I want to thank you for that letter. And so thanks, Mark. Thanks for writing in. And I know that I have one more letter to read, and I'm going to read it because why not? Why not read it? I'm just going to try and catch up on all these letters because they're awesome. Wow. I forgot to read this letter too. No, I didn't. Actually, I didn't forget to read that letter. I just need to find it. I got to find. I don't know where it is. Well, I'll look. And you know what, Stubble? You write me enough. I'll read it tomorrow. I'll find it. Suthia says, do you all Panera? Very expensive, but very tasty. Suthia, I haven't been to Panera in a while, but we used to go to Panera. Like we'd take Gilbert when he was younger to the dog park, like on Sunday. And we go to Panera first, have a little coffee or pastry. I like their mac and cheese. But on that note, I'm going to bring our chat to an end. This has been a fun chat. I've really enjoyed all of you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for the support of the channel. I want to thank my moderators for being here. Detective Jim, the Honorable Mayor, Mr. Bodden, Mike Bodden, Greg Smith. And I want to thank also Terry, Terry is very funny. And it's great to see that everybody is here. Great to have Vesna here. Great to have all of you guys here. Remember, Vesna comes all the way from Sarajevo. And whenever I hear the word Miss Sarajevo, I think about YouTube, because they have that song Miss Sarajevo. Anyway, just me. If you could like this channel and subscribe, that would be very much appreciated. It's great to have you guys here. It's the YouTube analytics really appreciate when people like the channel. But if you think I'm a monumental douchebag, you don't have to. I mean, clearly every one of these chats get like 4 downvotes at least. So there's got to be a few people out there that just go and they want to make sure I get a downvote, which I think is kind of funny. I hope if you downvote me, at least participate in the conversation, because there's a lot of great people here with a lot of great points of view. The Post-Geek Singularity community, you imagination connoisseurs are what make this bearable. And guess what? Tomorrow will be the 150th live Robservations chat. I mean, maybe I should sing Barry Manilow's Copacabana. That's my go-to karaoke song. I could perhaps do that. I'd have to do it a cappella, or maybe not, but I don't know. But maybe I should do something special. I want to say what's really special about it is you guys have made this special, because I wouldn't even be here if you were not watching this chat. It's great. Hopefully we'll have another lively discussion. I really appreciate everybody being here. And remember, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. And you know what? Detective Jim will probably say that many of the stories you hear people tell aren't true. But anyway, I'd like to believe the best. And all you have to do either way is listen to those stories. After all, aren't people great? And with that, I say to you, have a better day. Thanks for being here. And remember, this chat was brought to you by Lucky Tiger Men's Grooming Products, for those men who want to look good and feel great. And if you go to their website at getluckytiger.com, you can buy their products. And if you punch in PGS for Post-Geek Singularity, you get 20% off your order. Amazing. Send me letters at Burnettwork.net. Remember, Robservations is a show about something, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a better day.